there was a man sent from God to bring a message to the people of Nineveh. The people needed to turn from their wicked ways or their world would be destroyed. The book later recorded how Jonah tried to escape his calling by boarding a ship for somewhere as far away as possible. When a terrible storm came up, the sailors threw Jonah overboard, but 3 days later a giant fish delivered him to his original destination. It happened that the people of Nineveh worshipped a fish god, and the name of their city even meant place of fish. Jonah's arrival from the mouth of the great fish was compelling. It is not the purpose of this fable to poke holes in the book, but it's a narrative issue if Nineveh is the landlocked city in the Iraqi desert. I wondered whether Jonah could do his mission in Rome instead, the place of fermented fish sauce, but Jonah, meanwhile, seized the opportunity of my confusion to run all the way to the Red Sea, where he talked his way onto an exploratory mission to somewhere as far away from the Mediterranean as possible. Jonah is the only character in this fable who's ahistorical in scale, though not in spirit. Conventional knowledge tells that human settlement in the Pacific is so recent that an Old Testament runaway would have found most of it empty. But local myth stretches way back to the time when there was a big fisherman named Maui Portugi. Picture the captain of the fabulous explorer ship exchanging mythology with a tohunga of the tropics. Neither is Maui himself, but each knows something about him. One party tells the other how the fish was so big that when the spiteful brothers cut into it with their paddles, the grooves were like mountain ranges. And the fishhook he used? It was made of his grandmother's jawbone. The fish, in all seriousness, is actually so big that you have to climb up the celestial vine to see the ray shape. It's big enough that a man could live in its belly for as many days and generations as the story requires. And over the recent age of Pisces, there have been plenty of Jonahs who came from different parts of the world and were swallowed by it. Eventually, a group of them stood out from the previous arrivals in that they brought a book with them, and when it opened, new worlds were revealed. When Hongi Hika went to see the King of England in 1820, he'd been to Sydney already, and he knew what he was doing. His companion, the Anglican missionary Thomas Kendall, had a way with words, and was tasked with working on the first dictionary of the language of New Zealand. Now, 5 years since the British victory over France, it's also not just an idiom to say that they were talking about the price of fish. Several men in London are very interested in the ownership of this fish, the other fish too. King George IV greeted the traveller as King Hongi and gifted him a musket and a suit of chainmail. Hongi is a greeting and is unlikely to have been the man's given name. Hika means fish, but Hongi Hika was no king of this fish. He was chief only of a region of the tail of the fish in Northland. On the return journey, they acquired several hundred more muskets, gunpowder and shot in Sydney, the bill paid by a nobleman of dubious nationality who was promised the ownership of a large slice of the fish in return. The northern tribe of Ngāpuhi then set out to conquer their neighbours, bringing home slaves who were put to work raising potatoes and pigs for sale. The Church Missionary Society's first dictionary, published at the end of 1820, covered the case of exchanging these food products for more muskets and gunpowder. Hongi Hika lived for 8 years after his journey, but never approached kingship. In the last year, he lived with a bullet wound in his chest and may have been feeling a change of heart. The message that he left for his people is recorded as, "After I am gone, be kind to the missionaries. Be kind also to the other Europeans. Trade with them, protect them, and live with them as one people. But if ever there should land on this shore a people who wear red garments, who do no work, who neither buy or sell, and who always have arms in their hands, then be aware that these are a people called soldiers, whose only occupation is war. Then, O my children, be brave, that you may not be enslaved, and that your country may not become the possession of strangers." This deathbed scene is 16 years before younger relative Hongi Hika most famously humiliated the Empire's red-coated soldiers at Kororareka. But the following generation of War in the North doesn't actually have any fish in it. So this fable is moving over to the Eastern Wing for the next century. It was peacetime, locally, for a generation after 1840, and children were going to school in mission stations like the one at Wairenga Hika, which means the clearing of the fish, or Hika's clearing. The various regional languages and cultures were starting to move, with the power of the book, towards new standards called Maori and Anglicanism, or here and there Catholicism. In 1865, a group called the Ho-Ho came into the region. The members, from various tribes, were united by a new and charismatic religion that violently rejected the missionaries. The mission station at Wairenga Hika was evacuated, and a force of 500, who were mostly tangata whenua of the local Ngati Porou tribe, besieged the Ho-Ho for 6 days until they surrendered. Around 400 men, women and children were taken prisoner and later deported to a penal colony on the Chatham Islands. One man among them had fought on the victorious side, but was then accused of spying for the Ho-Ho and supplying them with ammunition. One story goes that this man kept demanding to be tried in a court of law before being deported for an unproven accusation, and that's how he came to use the epithet Te Kooti. I'm uncomfortable about it because, while I certainly endorse the man's theoretical right to be tried in a court of law, there's no reason to endorse him calling himself a court of law. The man known as Te Kooti started his rise to leadership in 1868, the third year on the island, and his fellow prisoners were the first followers of the new religion that he founded, Ringatu. They say that his hands glow when he speaks from the Bible, although his uncle told the guards that it's an illusion using phosphorus from match heads. He predicted that a larger ship alongside a smaller one will soon arrive and become their ark of salvation back to the mainland. This fable takes the view that the accuracy of the prediction was not magic, but a political scheme. The contingent of guards on the island had been reduced to only 15 men, and consider the possibility that someone paid off the captain of the supply ship. The captain remained in relative comfort on the island, while the mate and crew followed orders to carry several hundred men, women and children to the east coast. The records emphasize that this chapter began as an almost non-violent revolution. One of the exceptions was the same uncle who had doubted his nephew's magical abilities, thrown overboard as a Jonah, that is, one who can be blamed for unfavourable winds. The war that followed rapidly became a genocide, with the particulars of provocation from government forces and retaliation from the growing Ringatu followers recorded in the written word, also, unspeakably, in the generations who descended from that time. Te Kooti is a title which implies the legal power of the court, and his other title, Arikirangi, implied a spiritual power that was in conflict with the Maori king movement as much as it was with church or state. He was known for escaping, and he lived until 1893, leaving the region and religion preoccupied with who the prophesied successor would be. In 1905, it had been 12 years since their leader's death, and the Ringatu were divided. Then, Rua Kenana told how he found the legendary diamond under the shroud of Te Kooti on Maunga Pohatu, the sacred mountain. He covered it again with his own cloak. When Rua called the people to come and settle at Maunga Pohatu, many hundreds came. The Tuhoi and their neighbours, the Whakatohea, had been crushed, first by the state retribution against what was actually the inter-regional Ho-Ho group, and then by the Te Kooti Wars. The followers of Rua call themselves the Iharaira, a transliteration of Israelites. The mountain has been held as sacred since the times when the elders spoke of fairies, but the land was difficult to cultivate. The roads that were promised were never built. The Tohunga Suppression Act of 1907 criminalised the use of the traditional plants as medicine, and then in 1916, the paperwork reported breaches of the liquor licensing laws.
Time is short and we've been told winter's cold, on this mountain few grow old. Tui ha, too hard did not go to war. Rua kept the ancient lore on Moa too.
The ones with arms in their hands were blue-coated civilian police. Soldiers no longer wore red coats, and they had all been conscripted into service far away. That Rua's men were not among them was the real reason for the arrest. Rua's role in this fable is twofold. First, we'd like to uphold him as our founding father and model of conscientious objection. The other, and more fabulous half of the story, is that the mythical diamond is a clue about the power of the land and of sacred leadership. Some hold that the diamond myths of the Ringatu faith are a simple confusion between diamonds, which are not generally found on our islands, and the common white quartz. But I won't be downsold. The originator, the man known as Te Kooti Arikirangi, may have been a charlatan, but he was no fool. Rua Kenana came to be accepted as his successor, despite differences in character, through his mythical labours culminating with finding the diamond. A diamond is formed of carbon under enormous pressure, and if one climbs a little further up the celestial vine, one may note that the submerged continent of Zealandia, or Great Southern Continent, as it was once known, is such a big fish that that fish could eat this fish. I confess to feeling fear in my body that amongst all those tentacles, I can't even tell where its mouth is. And where there's a really big fish, often there's a fisherman. I've seen threads that promise to lead to which foreign fishermen are after this fish, but I suggest that those lines are generally bait. Anyone who follows them just finds that when there's one of them, there'll be two of them, and after one fish, two fish comes Red Chris, Blue Chris, and what they each promise to do about the price of fish. If we're serious about not taking the bait of controlled politics and controlled religion, then this is the time for a Jonah to step out of the interior. Picture Jonah outside Queensgate Mall in Lower Hutt, tagging on to the bus towards the Fish's Throat and Wellington City. I can't help picturing a long-haired, wild-eyed Jonah with a sign that reads, "The end is nigh, repent and be saved." But that version of the message has been around for some generations already. Maybe Jonah appears young and tidy, and with a prophetic gift for public transport communication. He introduces himself to his neighbour. "I read what it says about me in the book," he says. It does capture the frustration pretty well. My most beautiful, most compelling words. And all that some wanted to ask was how big the fish was. "Have you read the New Testament as well?" asks the neighbour. "Now that's a man who understands me," says Jonah. "He said he's a bigger fish than I, but he also said there's always a bigger fish. I appreciate that. Evolution is a spiral from the smaller to the greater."